Welcome to night one of the best Civil War story. Readings from the diaries of 5 prominent Jefferson County families written just before, during, and after the Civil War.
In Follyland, what witchery, what pretty looks, what eyes there be, what gamesome ways, what dimpled smiles, what lissom limbs, what frolic wiles, what easy laughter, fresh and clear, what pranks to play, what jest to hear. Old time forgets to shake his sand. The days go tripping hand in hand in Follyland. In Follyland. In Follyland.
Chapter 1, the 1850s, the days that never end, but that did. The wheat harvest was gathered, and the heats of midsummer were beginning to drive all who had means and leisure to congregate about famous springs and cool places in the mountains. Tuesday, August 4th, 1857, Shepherdstown, Virginia, the day of the horses. The ring tournament at Leeland Field. On Tuesday last, a large assemblage of people consisting of the youth and beauty of Jefferson and Berkeley counties in Washington County, Maryland, collected at Leeland, near this place to witness the exciting scenes of a tournament that came off there. The tournament lists were staked out on a long level of evenly mowed turf, some 400 yards in length, guarded on either side by a railing of rope, and spanned near the further extremity by an arch of evergreen boughs, and from the center of which the ring was suspended. Outside of these lines were double rows of light wagons and carriages regularly packed and filled with eager spectators, and near the center were several extensive pavilions made of wagon covers and bolting cloths, or more agreeably thatched with fresh green boughs, shading rows of rough plank seats already occupied by the elite of the company, rustic dames whose silks and ribbons, or maidens whose delicate cheeks shun the scorching sunshine. Between the stress circle and the rope barrier, the space was crowded with undistinguished multitude of leather-faced mountaineers, and squatting or lounging about upon the grass of lint-headed, bare-legged children, and Negroes full of hilarity and vociferous expectation. Prior to the tilting, the gallant knights were addressed by the president, Mr. Henry Kyd Douglas of Ferry Hill, Maryland, in the following neat and appropriate speech. His delivery was bold, clear, and impressive for one so young.
Gallant knights, you have assembled here today, not for the purpose of provoking Iron Mars, but that you may exhibit your devotion to the fair daughters of Eve, and given them assurances that as you now make known your consciousness of their charms, so will you ever consider it your greatest duty and supreme pleasure to protect those charms, though death alone be your reward. You need no allusion to knights of ancient days to increase your valor, nor stories of bleeding champions and fainting ladies to arouse your gallantry. You possess that generous spirit which would welcome the sword as readily as the harmless lance, did the cause of love require it. But even if you did not, you have before you a picture of loveliness that could change the hermit into a sprightly courtier, make the tottering sire forget his hoary hairs, and straightway as a boy again. And the merry hearts of these fair ladies are beating in unison with yours. For as your fleet steeds pursue their swift course, and you hasten towards that fatal ring, they wait in anxious, sympathizing expectation, and hail your success with a smile, or announce your failure with a sigh, knowing that you feel doubly inspired by the beautiful scene before you, and bearing on your banner the motto, Cupid and the ladies, I bid you charge, and may the God of love grant you success, and your reward the smiles of the fair with crowns of rosy garlands.
The hour had come. The trumpet call had sounded. The enlisted knights were already mustered behind the barns. The ladies were lightly and gracefully dismounted, and their horses led away. Choice seats had been reserved in the green pavilion, and a sweep of the chief's broadsword removed the rope barriers from their path. As one lady ascended the steps, all the men and boys within range jostled each other and stretched their necks to catch a glimpse, while all the rosy cheeks turned pale with curious envy. The music ceased. The vocal murmurs died away. The orator and knights remounted to join the muster behind the barn. We never before saw such an array of female beauty and chivalry as was there assembled. The following are the names of the officers and knights. Henry Kyd Douglas, President. James L. Towner, Samuel Moore, Heralds. R. Davis Shepherd, Jr., Samuel B. Neal, Judges. George H. Murphy, Knight of Ivanhoe. Thomas Chapline, Hotspur. R.T. Berry, Harvey Percy. E.G. Lee, Knight of Alhambra. George R. Bettinger, Saladin. Joseph T. Huss, Rienzi. Daniel Morgan, Longstar. Dr. P. Grove, Knight of Woodbury. The riding at Leeland was very graceful and well done, exciting and animating, evidencing great proficiency in equestrianism, and abundantly showing that the chivalry of the Old Dominion is still in keeping with the worldwide reputation she has won in days of yore. It is impossible to give a detailed account of it, but the horses, catching the spirit of the rider, flew like the wind, and their flashing eyes and foaming mouths betrayed the high excitement. After 3 alternate charges by each knight, R.T. Berry, George H. Murphy, and Dr. P. Grove were declared the victors. At night, the exercises of the day were wound up by a magnificent cotillion. The company repaired to the hotel, where a most sumptuous feast was spread there, with the flow of champagne and the exchange of toasts consuming the afternoon. Everyone then retired to their rooms to prepare for the fancy ball. At about 8:30 o'clock, the spacious ballroom was thronged with spectators awaiting entrance of the Queen and her champion, cortege, and attendants. At the sound of the music, the folding doors at the upper end of the room were suddenly opened, and the Queen and her champion, richly dressed in fancy costumes, the same wreath of such freshness resting on his brow, appeared, followed by the knight and maids of honor and a long train of attendants, all fancifully attired. There were some others whom we noticed were magically attracting much attention, and there was one, the gayest in the revel, the lightest in the dance, who, like a fairy on a festival morning, she tripped in the merry quadrille. Bright blushes her features adorning, she conquered the crowd at her will.
Chapter 2. Working Jefferson County's peaceful, fertile lands. The highly profitable wheat fell to the scythe at the bower where young, tall, wiry, Adam, Steve, and Danridge took place in the line along with enslaved African Americans John Pinko and Levin. Harvest crews helped from farm to farm. If the neighbors had not finished their harvest, the force was allowed to go and help them out, receiving for themselves the usual wages. In all the fields of corn, the outside rows were planted in a broom corn for the Negroes' use, and they spent the long winter evenings in making brooms, baskets, hampers, and split-bottom chairs, all of which found a ready sale in the country stores. The chairs were of all sizes, from the large porch chairs down to low sewing chairs and chairs for children. They managed to make them very comfortable and were substantial and lasted a lifetime.
In September, the cloth and yarn for winter work were brought home from the factory along the river, and the work of making up began and was only finished at Christmas. In every household there was a woman who would cut out the garments, and all the younger girls had been taught how to sew and to knit. And during the year, all the girls in clean frocks assembled in some room in the great house every morning, and the class of sewers and knitters was presided over by some bespectacled old Negro woman whose word was law to the girls. The work of making up the clothing and knitting yarn socks went on under her supervision, and at Christmas every man and woman on the place appeared in new clothes and new shoes and a warm woolen stockings. Every man had an overcoat every 4 years and a flannel hack jacket called by the Negroes the warmest to wear under his waistcoat in cold weather.
Tobacco was issued to each worker once a week, and sometimes it was bought in kegs of about 100 pounds and was called black strap, and one strap, sometimes two, was the ration. Some people chewed it, some of them smoked it in their corncob pipes, but this was before the days of fertilizer, when tobacco was raised on virgin soil.
Chapter 3. Henry Bettinger and Alec Boteler, the creative congressman. Alexander Alec Boteler, who had inherited Fountain Rock, married Helen Stockton, and they had Helen, known as Tippy, Charlotte, known as Lottie, Elizabeth, known as Lizzie, and Alec Jr. Preceding Boteler as the area's congressman in Washington was Henry Bettinger, who met Caroline, or Carrie Lawrence, the daughter of a fellow congressman who, only after he found the forces of love unstoppable, consented to the pact. Before the Bettingers accepted the honorable adventure of setting sail for Denmark, and Bettinger being our first ambassador there for most of the 1850s, the two young fathers and husbands were friends, both young lawyers with families. Each also had a strong penchant for art, for Henry, poetry, for Alec, drawing and painting.
While his future wife was en route to Princeton in a carriage, she heard of this Alec Boteler. The story she heard of her future husband was that he had thrown a farmer into the water to copy his expression of terror on his paper, and that the man accidentally drowned. And the young student, never recovering from his remorse, had become a gloomy, morose, and changed man. One afternoon, soon after his arrival at college, in passing a large brick house, he noticed, outlined against the window, the profile of a beautiful girl who was evidently intent upon her reading. He quickly drew out his pencil and sketchbook and made rapid outlines. Well, on getting back to the college, he finished it and showed it to a fellow student in triumph as the prettiest girl he had ever seen. "Why, that's Miss Stockton!" exclaimed his friend, who was A.S. Dandridge, who lived in Jefferson County and would own the Bower. "If you think she's up to your standard, I'll take you see her tomorrow night." But Alec Boteler's meeting Helen Stockton inspired him out of his gloom and his absurd behavior, Once married and with responsibilities settling on their dreamy shoulders, Alec would love getting together with his creative friend and forever treasure their times together with their wives and children elsewhere. Henry Bettinger was home at his ancestral home at Bedford, nearby and just outside Shepherdstown around 1851, when he tossed off a limerick to his neighbor over the hill at Fountain Rock. The invitation, inspired by his recent readings of Robert Burns, went thus.
My wife's a wa, my wife's a wa, now American she me tease. She's gone tell her father and mither and I can do as I please. So if you're in for a night of joy, and gin grat fun ye wad see, just stone your plaidie, my merry boy, and o'er the meadow to me. A wee bit room in the eastern wing, a ceiling so love and snug, a cheerful blaze in the chimney nook, and a blain's a bit of a jug. A bit of a jug with a barley bree, a jest and a merry song, and twa, thra friends what helping me to push the hours along. The wind may roar, the rain may fa, my wife's a wa, my wife's a wa. An American she me tease, she's gone till her fither and mither and and we can do as we please. After serving in Congress for 4 years, Henry Bettinger left with his family for Denmark,
where his daughter Danska was born. But homecoming, then tragedy. In November 1858, Henry Bettinger had indeed come home to Shepherdstown and his family to great joy. His daughter, Mary, watched from a window from their home at the southwest corner of Princess and German Street. In the center of the street that November night in 1858 was a huge bonfire, and her father's joyous, speechifying face shone in the hot blaze, making them cheer more and more in the cold. Then 8-year-old Mary noticed the adults in their house had become silent and huddled. Their father came home, and a great blow suddenly was called home. Pneumonia took him. And Carrie sold Henry's share of his ancestral home of Bedford back to his sister Henrietta and her husband Edmund Lee, a first cousin of the General Robert E. Lee. Carrie then used the money to build a new, more modest home near town Carrie called Poplar Grove. From Daniel Morgan's heirs, Carrie purchased the farm with a brick house in the middle of a grove of great oaks and poplars. She built an addition to the old house with woodwork of black walnut, so common in those days, and there she took her young family just before the storm of the war between the states took over their land. The Bettingers' writing genes continued to create through Henry and Carrie's children. Henry's gifted youngest daughter, Carolyn Bettinger, nicknamed Danska, was already a prodigious writing talent and even shared editing preferences in her poems with Mr. Boteler. Danska's daughter, Serena, wrote in later years, "The Bettinger children seem to have taken to writing books as duck like to water. They all complained the paper was too scarce and too hard to write on, but they utilized every scrap that came to them. Danska's foil was poetry with a few romantic stories for good measure. Mary's, I'm told, was fairy tales, with which she could enthrall her younger brother and sister. Of little Danska it can be said, the ink was in the baby. She was born to write a book." And she was. It was not long out of the cradle before she began to wield her pen, as she presented a book of original poetry, a present, to Honorable A.R. Boteler, with a note in the book saying that he must excuse the writing as the paper was hard to write on, and compared to Shakespeare and Milton it was not that good either. Another note calls attention to the fact that the these and thous are customarily used instead of yous in poetry, and apologizes for a few yous that had slipped in.
We ramble on, the stream and I, still singing, still companionless. We run to find beneath the sky some arid spot, some life to bless. The brook is dreaming of the sea, but I, fond spirit, dream of thee.
Chapter 4. The War Storm Gathers, and Butler goes to the south. Alex Butler took a seat for the first time in the United States Congress the same month in 1859. John Brown and 4 of his raiders were hanged in Charlestown after they tried to capture the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. They had hoped to inspire a wholesale rebellion by those enslaved, and they did succeed in igniting the enslavement issue with John Brown's blow against slavery and the hangings of Brown's raiders in Charlestown following convictions in a state court. A chasm of difference was made obvious to both Northerners and Southerners. 4 candidates ran in the ensuing months for the presidency instead of the usual 2 because of the volatile political season, thus electing the Midwesterner, Abraham Lincoln. Seeing that they had lost the upper hand in Washington, most Deep South states seceded at once on the tragically mistaken assumption that Lincoln would not go to war to retain them. Moreover, the United States Army was small, and the powers of the president as commander-in-chief were scarcely defined in the text of the Constitution, so little did they anticipate that Lincoln would simply create those powers in the void. Alexander Butler was bitterly opposed to the disruption of the Union, but when Virginia seceded, he resigned from Congress and threw his lot with the Confederacy. He was a member of its Provisional Congress and later served in the first regular Congress of the Confederate States. Moreover, he was chairman of the House committee which designed the Confederate flag. And he himself combined suggestions from many and added his own to make the final seal. In fact, he offered the successful Joint Resolution 13 on April 30th, 1863, making the seal he helped design official.
Chapter 5, April 1861. Drumbeats. The elders in the Lee, Butler, Bettinger, Dandridge, Allen, Douglas, Pendleton, and Morgan households watched their men enlist. Many opposed secession, but enlisted in the Confederate units when the Federals called out for thousands of volunteers. The Bettingers at Poplar Grove and the Pendletons at Westwood were so deeply opposed to enslavement that they either didn't do it, or at Westwood, gave the choice of freedom to the large number of those they had enslaved. The act of provocation by Confederate forces at Fort Sumter in South Carolina gave President Abraham Lincoln the legal justification for calling for 75,000 volunteers to forcibly bring back those seceding states and their people. And the war would, it first appeared, start right here in Jefferson County, where the strategic Baltimore and Ohio Railroad dipped briefly into Virginia that had just acted to join a foreign country. April 18, 1861. On that fateful night, after Virginia's conditioned vote to secede from the United States, many local militiamen were already en route to Harper's Ferry to take control of the federal arsenal, basing their action on a word-of-mouth understanding that their action was legal and officially sanctioned. The acting militia commander, a 31-year-old professionally trained officer from Summit Point named James Allen, was confronted and cautioned by locally born but ardent Unionist David Hunter Strother.
As the local militia moved towards Harper's Ferry at the urgings of Turner Ashby on the night of April 18th, Strother, a lifelong friend of those present, intervened, arguing that no formal written order had been produced to authorize the militias to move on the federal arsenal in the lower town in order to capture its estimated 16,000 weapons and weapons-making equipment. In fact, the vote by the popularly elected Virginia Secession Convention had occurred the previous day in Richmond, voting 85 to 55 to secede, but only after the results were known of a referendum scheduled for the following month. Just as Colonel Allen was taking Strother's point to heart and ordered his militia only so far as Hall Town, pending the substantiation of his orders, when there erupted from the lower town, out of their line of sight, as Strother recalled, flashes and detonations, several times repeated. Then a steadier flame was seen rising from two distinct points, silently and rapidly increasing in volume until each rock and tree on the Loudoun and Maryland heights were distinctly visible, and now the overclouded sky ruddied with a sinister glare. This occurred, I think, between 9 and 10 o'clock. Some thought they heard artillery, but no, the more skillful presently guessed the truth and concluded that the officer in command had set fire to the arsenals and abandoned the town. With the ashes of the arsenal cooling, Strother perceived in the light of the next day the enormity of the events. I must confess that I felt this morning like a man wandering in a maze. So it seemed that the sudden gust of emotion, excited by the lowering of our starry flag, had swept away the mists of speculation and revealed in its depth and breadth the abyss of degradation opened by secession. Yesterday, I was a citizen of the great American Republic. My country spanned a continent. Our northern border near the frigid zone, while our southern limit touched the tropics. Her eastern and western shores were washed by the two great oceans of the globe. Her commerce, covering the most remote seas, her flag honored in every land. The strongest nations acknowledged her power, and the most enlightened honored her attainments in art and science and literature. Her political system is the cherished ideal toward whose realization the noblest aspirations and efforts of mankind have been directed forever. The great experiment which the pure and wise of all nations are watching with trembling solicitude and imperishable hope. It was something to belong to such a nationality. This was yesterday. Today, what am I? A citizen of Virginia? Virginia? a petty commonwealth with scarcely 1,000,000 white inhabitants. What could she ever hope to be but a worthless fragment of the broken vase? A fallen and splintered column of the once glorious temple. But I will not dwell longer on the humiliating contrast. Come, harness up the buggy and let us get out of this, or I shall suffocate.
Jefferson County's fighting-age male Union sympathizers, threatened with arrest for treason against the newly forming Confederacy, left the county.
Yes, we'll rally around the flag, boys, rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. We will rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor and up with the stars. While we rally round the flag, boys, we rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
But as the gravitational forces of solidarity brought most of the remaining white young men to enlistment points for the Confederacy, their destiny was with Virginia, as Logan Osborne of Cabletown so famously concluded. Their wives and mothers began feverishly making havelocks and clothing for their young men. Roughly 900 men from Jefferson County would fight for the Confederacy in 13 different units during the war. At least 130 Jefferson County-born African Americans fought in the United States Colored Troops, and a smaller number of white countyans enlisted in a variety of scattered federal units. 8,000 enlistees would flock to Bolivar Heights by May 23rd from as far away as Mississippi, joined soon by a strange West Point graduated professor from Virginia Military Institute named Thomas Jonathan Jackson. Jackson quickly put them through their paces and drilled them so relentlessly that the notions of war as a grand brief lark were dashed. Some complained that the exercises were meant to kill them sooner than a fired bullet.
William Fitzhugh Lee, a career Army officer, was raised in part by the Shepherdstown Lees after his father died in Alexandria. By the time of the war, he had graduated from Virginia Military Institute, had married Lily Perrin of Shepherdstown, and fathered their daughter, Laura. In April 1861, he arrived to help in the instruction of the ever-increasing number of hungry recruits at Bolivar Heights, all thinking they would defend Harper's Ferry against invasion. His family was at their home on the northeast corner of German and Mill Street with Lily's remarried mother, Laura Perrin Towner. Edwin Grayley, who once dressed up as the Knight of Alhambra at the erstwhile tournament, was the eldest son of Edmund and Henrietta Lee, likewise came to camp and was soon Jackson's aide-de-camp. Now the Lees tried to visit them at Camp Jackson at Bolivar Heights near Harper's Ferry while the drilling was underway, and Henrietta Lee wrote her eldest daughter, Ida Rust, about it.
Your papa took Virginia and me up to see them last week. We met with our usual luck, broke down twice, and after various delays and accidents got there at 3:30, stayed half an hour and jolted home. which we reached at 10 o'clock at night, being 11 hours in that spring wagon. Their horse Jiminy Criminy had become skittish and refused to cross a small stream as they neared the noisy encampment. They were therefore compelled to borrow another horse to get them home. Oh, at times I am so sick of noise and wrangling and contest that I long for the wings of a dove to fly me away.
Henry Kyd Douglas, the 23-year-old one-time president of that ring tournament from just a few years before, and who lived with his family at Ferry Hill, overlooking the Potomac from Maryland side, he also arrived at the camp, come what may. His father, Reverend Robert Douglas, was the part owner of the valuable covered wooden bridge at River's Edge in Shepherdstown. Douglas later reflected on the issues of the Civil War and his place in it.
Personally, I had no feeling of resentment against the people of the North because of their desire for the emancipation of the enslaved. For I believed Negro slavery was a curse to the people of the Middle States. As a boy, I had determined never to own any one. When on the 17th of April, 1861, the Virginia Convention passed the Ordinance of Secession, I had no doubt of my duty. In a week, I was back on the Potomac. When I found my mother sewing on heavy shirts with a heart doubtless heavier than I knew, I suspected for what and whom they were being made. In a few days, I was at Harper's Ferry, a private in the Shepherdstown Company, Company B, 2nd Virginia Infantry. On June 13, 1861, General Joseph Johnston, who replaced the less experienced Jackson, won the argument to not stay and defend Harper's Ferry and ordered his force to evacuate Harper's Ferry, taking different directions. Some moved up the river, another larger force toward Charlestown. They would reunite in Berkeley County, make their way, some using rail, toward Bull Run, Manassas, and fight in the first major battle of the war. Meantime, the Federal Army under General Robert Patterson was basically duped into remaining in the local region, not detecting the hurried movement of Johnston's men to the Manassas battle location. When General Robert Patterson began to demonstrate from Hagerstown to cross the Potomac at Williamsport, General Johnston determined to evacuate Harper's Ferry. I was with the regiment that marched to Shepherdstown to destroy the bridge over the Potomac. I was with the company that set fire to it, and when, in the glare of the burning timbers, I saw the glowing windows in my home on the hill beyond the river, I knew my father was a stockholder in the property that I was helping to destroy. I realized that war had begun. I knew that I was severing all connection between me and my family, and understood the cessation of one who, sitting aloft on the limb of a tree, cuts it off between himself and the trunk and awaits results. Not long after, I saw the heavens lighted up over in Maryland one dark night and knew that the gorgeous bonfire was made from the material and contents of my father's barn. I saw that I was advancing rapidly in a knowledge of the meaning of war, and my soul was killed with revengeful bitterness.
"'Tis a sigh that is wafted across the troubled wave. 'Tis a wail that is heard upon the shore. 'Tis a dirge that is murmured around the lowly grave. Oh, hard times come again no more. 'Tis the song the sigh of the weary. Hard times, come again no more. Many days you have lingered around my cabin door. Oh, hard times, come again no more.
As the armies inched closer to clashing, more men in Jefferson County enlisted, or at least tried to. At Westwood near Summit Point, Hugh Nelson Pendleton's son, Dudley Diggs Pendleton, a half-brother to Colonel Allen's wife, Julia, and he was a graduate of Washington College. Now, he had not yet met his future wife, Tippy Boulder, but he enlisted June 19th into the 1st Rockbridge Artillery at Winchester as war began to unfold. At the Bower Farm, 16-year-old Adam Stephen Dandridge wanted to enlist, but was prevented by his concerned parents. On July 2, 1861, as the first area battle erupted in Berkeley County at Falling Waters, the cannon could be heard across the valley with a different strange effect on each individual who met the blasts. Wrote Danska's daughter, Serena, much later.
Oh, it was a piping hot July day, the first day of the harvest in the Long Bottom, along the creek. The wheat was standing tall and fine that year, a heavy crop. Father was swinging the first cradle, and the colored cradlers were strung out in a long line beside him. He was only 16, but over 6 feet tall and wiry and tough. And as the cradling went on, the sun beat down more and more fiercely. And suddenly, the booming of cannon was heard from over the hills in the direction of Martinsburg. Well, like an electric shock, the words, "The war has begun," ran through the field. Father said he saw one of the cradlers, a big, strong colored man, give a yell and jump straight up in the air and fall down dead with sunstroke. It may be assumed that it was a heart condition, but in the field all was in confusion. Father flung his cradle down, and he and some of the boys got on horses and went on off to join the war. The dead man was carried home. The boys and horses were eventually corralled and brought back, the easier because the battle, which was only a skirmish, was over before they arrived. This was only the first time my father ran off to join the army. Oh, when my father was a young boy, the Bower was a busy and peaceful spot. He had learned to swim by being tossed into the flooded creek before the footbridge by one of the older cousins, Philip Pendleton Cook, with orders to "Swim, you little devil!" The manly art of self-defense was not neglected, and Papa was a match for the best, black or white, but he says their bouts were always friendly. As the time of the Civil War drew near, excitement was in the air, and the boys made themselves bows and arrows and staged sham battles. For one well-remembered day, Father dared the others to shoot at him, and one of the neighbor boys stepped in, drew a bead on him, quoting, "For Philip's right eye." Well, the arrow landed in my father's right eye. Of course, the pain was terrible. Finally, a cataract formed over the eye, and he was often in severe pain of it during the war.
In the wake of First War, Edwin Gray Lee sits at his wounded stepbrother Willie's bedside. Edwin Gray Lee recalled.
You know, we left Winchester on the 18th of July. We reached Manassas Junction on the 19th, and on the morning of the Saturday the 20th, we were placed in the reserve to General Longstreet behind the woods in the rear of the battlefield. While we lay there, I repeatedly saw Willie and conversed and laughed with him. Sunday, July 21st. Early on the morning of the 21st, we were moved, and we continued to shift our position until about 10 o'clock a.m., when we finally took one in reserve to General B's brigade. During this morning, I saw William frequently. About 11 o'clock, we got a request from General B to come to his support. General Jackson, I was his aide-de-camp, sent me to move the various regiments forward. And the last time I saw Willie was just as I bore the order to Colonel Cummins to move his unit. He was looking as calm and cheerful as ever. I saw him, and at 20 minutes before 12 o'clock, we entered the battle. About 2 p.m., the battle became terrific. Our artillery and that of the enemy kept up one continuous roar. Ricketts' Union Brigade fired 2 shots when it was charged by the 33rd. They drove the Yankees from the guns, but were not strong enough to hold them and were driven back. They charged again, William leading the left wing and Colonel Cummins on the right, and again took the battery and again had to abandon it. It was in this charge that William was shot. Colonel Cummins rallied his men, charged a third time, and took and kept the battery. The 33rd lost more than 1/3 in killed and wounded. Of 450 men present in the 33rd Virginia Regiment, 43 were killed and 140 wounded. When Willie was shot, he walked back up the hill but did not fall. He remarked to an officer, "I am shot," and the blood began to trickle from his breast. He was assisted to a distance of more than half a mile in the rear of the battleground, and then he had to lie down. All the charges occupied but a few minutes. About 3 o'clock, I was accosted by Dr. Cornelius Baldwin of the 33rd, who asked me if I knew that Captain Lee was shot. My heart sank, and I told him no, and I begged him to take me to him. He said no, but if I could stay with Dr. McGuire, who was overwhelmed there with the wounded, he would bring Willie there. I urged him to make all speed, and in a few minutes he brought William to us in a light spring wagon. We lifted him out as tenderly as we could and laid him in the shade on the ground. The day was extremely hot, and all around us was dust and confusion. Dr. McGuire immediately unbuttoned Willie's coat and vest as far as he could. The wound was right in the center of the breast between the first and second studs of his shirt. The missile that inflicted the wound had struck the third button of his coat, partly tore it off, and had just passed downward, driving the cloth of the coat, waistcoat, and small button coat, together with his shirt, about 1.5 inches into his breast. It required nearly the whole of a surgeon's strength to draw these things from the wound while I held Willie in my arms. The wound gave him much pain. The doctor carefully dressed it and laid him down in quite an easy position. He was too much hurt to be allowed to talk, and the only communication he made was either assent or dissent, indicated by the movement of his head. After the wound was dressed, I gave him some water and asked him if he felt easier. He nodded. I then told him that he must not speak, but that I must tell him that we had whipped the enemy and would soon drive them from the field. Just then, our gallant brigade made its final charge, and Generals E.K. Smith and Elzey came up with their fresh troops. The enemy broke and ran in the wildest panic, and that mighty, never to be forgotten shout of victory arose. I sat down and said, "Willie, do you hear that? We have whipped them and they are flying. The day is ours and we have gained an overwhelming victory." Oh, how his glorious eye brightened, and he feebly waved his hand and still more feebly whispered, "Hurrah." At this moment, Brigadier General Jackson came up with a shattered finger to have it dressed. As soon as it was done, he directed me to get on my horse and ride back with him on the field. A young friend who was by Willie's side assured me that he would never leave him and would see him well and comfortably taken care of and fixed. I was utterly unable to leave the field of battle until after dark, and even then I had not fulfilled the orders I had to execute. I got to my brigade about midnight, and next morning early I went to the house where I learned Willie had been taken. Willie was in a large room downstairs, and during all that time, save 3 days, was alone. My excellent young Harrison from Berkeley was by him, nursing him as tenderly as though it had been his own brother. He'd been up with him the whole night. Willie was still suffering very much, but was much better. He was still forbidden to talk, but he beckoned to me and said in a low whisper, "Eddie, write to Leeland, Mother." And I said, "Yes, Willie, but don't talk." He smiled and was perfectly quiet. Thursday, July 25th. Cousin Lily did not get my letter, but she did not know where she was. But being at Strasburg, she learned on Wednesday that Willie was wounded, and on Thursday she and Mrs. Swan, her cousin, came to the house where we were. They had great difficulty in getting there, but the kindness of some officers helped them through. Dr. Talcott Eliason, who lived up the road some little way, was more than kind and supplied so many comforts and conveniences.
If thou should call me to resign, what most I prize, it ne'er was mine. I only yield thee what was thine. Thy will be done. Thy will be done. Thy will be done.
Friday, July 26th. On Friday morning, Willie began to grow worse. In the afternoon, Mrs. Towner, Lily's mother, and Pa and Edmund came. I knew then from the surgeon that there was no hope. Oh, how my dear father wept over one whom he loved as his own son. Constantly, Willie asked us, as briefly as possible, to read to him and sing to him. And every thought and every breath was but full of confidence and faith and love towards our Heavenly Father and blessed Savior. He grew gradually worse from this, gangrene having ensued. Saturday, July 27th. On Saturday, Willie said, "Doctor, is there any hope?" Dr. Straith, who was unremitting in his efforts, replied, "Captain, I fear there is none." His wife and all of us were around him, and he said, "I had hoped to live to see my country established in her new government. But if thou orderest otherwise, O Father, thy will be done." He asked Pa to pray, but Pa was weeping so that he could not, and I prayed for him, for Willie, for his wife and child, for his mother, and for us who loved him dearly, that all of us might bow with humble hearts to the will of that God whose every act is full of love, and we might kiss the hand that ever chastens for our good, and remember that those who departed in Jesus were only gone before. And when I finished, Willie took up the prayer and prayed to the God of justice very briefly, for he could not talk much, but how fervently and how beautifully. Monday, July 29th, Tuesday, July 30th. I sat by him, watched him, nursed him, and scarcely ever left his side from this or during the whole time. But I have little more to tell. Tuesday night, July 30th, his brave heart ceased to throb. And the Blessed Father of Mercy took Willie to himself. And when I looked upon his thin chin, but calm and beloved face, for oh, dear aunt, how I loved him, my heart went up to God for those he left behind. And surely God will be with and bless them, for hath he not promised? Willie was so gentle, so patient, so full of love to those who were around him. He has only gone before, dear Aunt Mary, to await you in Father's home. The faithful soldier of Christ's cross has gone to join his Lord's glorious army, never, never more to leave it.
Relation and neighbor to both the Lees and Butlers, William A. Morgan, as part of Jeb Stuart's 1st Virginia Cavalry, wrote his wife, Anna Jacqueline, of his first acrid taste of war. Camp Fairfax Station, July 24, 1861. My dearest wife, I wrote you a very few hurried lines a day or two after the Manassas fight, merely to let you know that we were not killed. I do not know whether you have received them or not, and as I expect Mr. Sensen Diver to return to Shepherdstown, I will write more fully. We left the neighborhood of Winchester very suddenly and marched day and night for the junction, which we reached on Saturday, and we camped that night on what was the battlefield. The next day, Sunday, bright and early, the conflict began with the booming of artillery and the sharp reports of musketry, mingled hoarse commands given by the officers, the screams of the dying horses, and the groans of the wounded, which was kept up without intermission until moonlight. Our cavalry was drawn up in rear of the lines of the infantry and kept there until about 12 or 1 o'clock, when the order came for us to do our part, that is, to charge the enemy, which of course we did. We charged up to the right, upon which the New York Zouaves Regiment, formerly commanded by Colonel Ellsworth, was stationed, and owing to the dust and smoke which made vision impenetrable, the enemy did not see us until we were among them. With our pistols and sabers, we charged them through and through, and returned, cutting and riding them down in every direction. The charge was made just in a nick of time, for believe me, we were whipped beyond doubt, but our cavalry charge decided the day. Our cavalry, that is, 1 or 2 companies, suffered a good deal. 2 whole front ranks went down as they entered the enemy's lines, and myself and company were in the very center of their ranks. The balls were flying thick all around, apparently as thick as hail, and yet, strange to say, there was no one killed. 2 or 3 of us were slightly wounded, myself among the number. 3 or 4 horses were shot and bayoneted by the Zouaves. My wound was caused by the jam of the horses and men, and has ceased to give me any trouble. It was all in the knee of my right leg, and in an hour I'd forgotten it. In my first letter I didn't mention it for the reason it was not worth notice, so you need not be at all uneasy, for I assume I am in perfect health now. Our horse George behaved nobly, never flinching at any time. I rode over the field of battle the next morning to see the sad havoc by section being arrayed against section. Men and horses covered the ground in every direction, the most awful and ghastly sights. Some men the heads off from the shoulders, some with half heads torn to pieces, some disemboweled and mangled in every conceivable manner. To you and or your mother, I suppose it would be an awful spectacle. But to tell you the truth, I haven't as much sympathy as the most of you. Seeing so much blood and carnage soon became used to it, and my curiosity was only to know what sort of wound the poor wretch had received to kill him. There are dead everywhere, all around. Some crawled into the bushes and died. Some went a mile or two and died. Everywhere are the dead. And the whole country smells so offensively that no one can stay in it or near that region. Our loss in officers has been severe. You have no idea of the plunder that was taken. 500 wagons would not hold it. Arms, 40-odd pieces of artillery, numbers of elegant horses, any quantity of provisions and clothing, fancy articles, etc., etc. Our boys are literally loaded down, and I had to scold them for having so much about them. They all turned out in new clothes of the finest kind. Most of them had more clothes now than they ever had. When I started from Winchester, I had but one shirt, and that on my back. And after wearing it a week and a half, it was, of course, ready for a change. And seeing quantities of nice new shirts lying around, I just appropriated one for myself. I often think of you and my darlings at home. Often. You were in my thoughts on that dreadful Sunday after the fight had begun, and God alone knew whether I may ever see you all again. Kiss my dear children for me, and tell them not to forget me. Give my love to Mother, Lily, Cousin Rose, family. I saw Jim Towner yesterday, and he said he was glad you had his rooms and hoped you would make yourself comfortable. But camp duties now claim my attention, and I must stop. God bless you and protect you all. Goodbye. Ever yours, W.A. Morgan.
Shall we know in the hereafter all the reasons that are hid? Does the butterfly remember what the caterpillar did? How he waited, toiled, and suffered to become the chrysalid. When we creep so slowly upward, when each day new burden brings, when we strive so hard to conquer vexing sublunary things, when we wait and toil and suffer, we are working for our wings. When we wait and toil and suffer, we are working for our wings.
The harsh winter of 1861-1862 slowly yielded to spring and new growth, new signs of life reawakening. In late February 1862, Federal General Nathaniel Banks crossed into Virginia at Harper's Ferry, ventured through Charlestown, and continued deeply into the Shenandoah Valley, into what would be for his troops a disastrous encounter with Confederate General Stonewall Jackson's very fleet and hard-fighting brigade. Those enslaved persons in Jefferson County and beyond seized the opportunity to depart from the farms they worked and stubbornly affixed themselves and their families to this massive federal army while it was here and available. Many found work and shelter at Harper's Ferry. Their number probably would soon exceed 2,000, based on newspaper reports of the number of African Americans at Harper's Ferry in September 1862. The exodus began in March, shortly after Banks' army appeared in the county. His chief of staff, David Hunter Strother, whose wife lived in Charlestown, and who had memorably encountered his friends in the Virginia militia in April 1861 as war was starting, kept a diary that charted the number of African Americans arriving in the spring of 1862 at federal encampments. He remarked in his diary on March 8th,
An excitement was produced in Charlestown by the arrival of a wagon load of Negro women and children with bag and baggage as if bound for a free country. I understand they were forwarded to Harper's Ferry. Numbers of men have flocked into town more or less every day since our occupation of about 10 days. Enslaved persons were leaving their farms all over the county. At Adam Stephen Dandridge's farm, the Bower, Dandridge recorded leaving that spring of 1862 a woman and her 2 children, 2 men and 1 boy, some men, 38-year-old John Pinko and 19-year-old William. Enslaved African Americans also left Mount Pleasant farm of Charles Aglenby and his family, and he wrote in his farm diary of that spring, March 10, Monday, Negroes go into the Union lines, left the premises last night, the following slaves. Martha, 17 years old, sound, healthy, stout, color rather light. Laura, black, 39 years old, medium size, handy at all works. Lewis, 23 years old, not very tall, but thick set, complexion, copperish. Bob, 17, a mulatto, chunky, but not tall or large for his age. And Henry Robinson, the dark complexion, slender male, age supposed to be 30 or upwards. He's the property of Mrs. Elizabeth Strider and had Laura for his wife.
Captain Frank A. Donaldson, later of the 118th Pennsylvania Corn Exchange Regiment, described his first meeting George Slow while his army was moving towards Berryville from Charlestown in early March 1862. Donaldson wrote his brother March 15th from Bolivar, describing the beauty and devastation of Harper's Ferry, the homes in Charlestown, and then of his journey towards Berryville.
Dear brother, here I am again on old Virginia's sacred soil. In the few lines written from Harper's Ferry, I said I did not think much of the place. That was literally true as regards the town, but as to the beauty of the country, the magnificence of the surrounding landscape, there can be no question. Harper's Ferry is situated at the junction of the Shenandoah and Potomac rivers and is probably one of the most picturesquely located places in America. I can conceive of no more beautiful scene than just here. Then, too, it is full of memories of the stirring past, although desolation and ruin reign everywhere. There is scarcely anything besides a few standing walls to remind me of the busy arsenal where so many muskets, now in the hands of the enemies, as well as its own troops, were made by the government. I left on Thursday morning and rode as far as Charlestown, a distance of 9 miles, in Sutler's wagon. When finding he was not going further, I took up my journey on foot to Berryville, a distance of a trifle less than 13 miles. All along the good solid turnpike to Berryville, there were evidences of the passing of large bodies of troops, there being scarcely a fence rail left in the whole distance, and the sad havoc made with the woods, where an encampment had taken place and was most marked. I saw no soldiers during this tramp. The farmers appeared to have been at work, and the country, as far back as I could see, was well cultivated and full of fine-looking wheat. At least to my unpracticed eye, it looked remarkably good and heavy. As we moved away from the vicinity of Charlestown, we saw a number of Negroes leaning on a fence surrounding a neat little house on what appeared to be a large plantation. Captain Urey spoke to one of them and asked whether he would like to join the army. Replying that he would, the captain told him to come along, and he or 2 or 3 others did so. In conversation with him, I learned his name to be George Slow, and that he was or had been a slave. But his master, Pendleton, knowing that he could not keep his slave, had given George his freedom. George would like me to go back and corroborate what his master said. He has been a house servant and nicely brought up. We like him very much, and he is a first-rate cook and very handy generally.
We will welcome to our numbers the loyal, true, and brave, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And although they may be poor, not a man shall be a slave, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
Thank you for coming to night 1 of the best Civil War story. We'd like to thank Terry Tucker for providing the music of our show. And our presenters, Ardith Gilbertson, Homer Speaker, yours truly, Tim Surkamp, John Bloomquist for sound and lighting. Rob, he worked on this. He was sick. We also like to thank Rob Perks for videotaping tonight. We thank Jan Hafer for her fetching family portrait, and Dean Seiler of Look in Pop's Attic on German Street for the loan of these wonderful treasures, period accurate, of in our background here. So, and Laura Bacon in the Black Box Theater. Please join us tomorrow evening for night 2, where we hear the accounts of the horrors of the Battle of Antietam, the improvised hospitals in every nook and cranny of Shepherdstown, and then the much welcome encampment at the Bower, including a grand ball and hilarious surprise by performances by Colonels Von Bork and Bryan. And you may buy tickets in the foyer after the performance. Thank you and good night.